All right, why don't we get started? It's officially 12:03. So welcome everybody. My name is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. Welcome to our Bee Forum. We're hoping to create a big buzz. I'm really sorry for all the puns. I'm just not going to be able to help myself though. I hope you are all well. A couple of housekeeping things. Please kindly put yourself on mute. We're going to have three wonderful panelists. We're each going to talk for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have questions and answers after that. And also, if you do have questions as they come up, please put them in the chat, and we will be taking questions from the chat so we can stay organized and focused. We did have 95 people register for this event, so I think as the minutes tick on, more and more people are going to join, and we don't want it to become unruly. So I'm very excited about this. This is a new program by Citizens Campaign for the Environment to protect bees. As you know well, bees are really responsible for pollinating millions of agricultural crops and really are one of the most important parts of the global ecosystem and also our global economy. And they like to say that whatever is on your plate, you can actually thank a bee for that. So we agree, actually. Gardens would be empty and your plates would also be empty if it wasn't for the miraculous work of these little insects. We like to say that bees keep the cycle of life turning. So we've put together, I think, a great panel today. Let me just quickly tell you who they are. Our first speaker is going to be Deborah Klughers. Deborah is actually a certified master beekeeper. She owns and operates a company called Bonac Bees, which is located in the beautiful, tranquil East Hampton in New York. And she's also, I guess in her spare time, the editor of the Journal of American Apiary Society. Our second speaker is going to be Daniel Owen Gilrein. Daniel is an entomologist with, we like to say, the other CCE, Cornell Cooperative Extension. Daniel has a master's from Cornell in pest management. And last but absolutely not least, we have another Daniel Rochelle. He actually is a staff attorney with a wonderful organization, NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council. Our CCE and NRDC partner a lot on issues, particularly protection of pollinators. Daniel has a long history of work with NRDC, from working on the Community Fracking Defense Project. Thank you, Daniel, for that. And now he works with their Land and Water Program, and he helps facilitate actually a statewide coalition on pollinator protection. So we've gathered some great talent. We're going to turn first to Deborah, who's actually going to be speaking to us from her hives. And I think you have over 100 honeybee colonies. Is that correct, Deborah?
I do, and I did a little math the other night. I'm managing about 5 million honeybees here on the east end of Long Island, so I think I have one right over here.
Have you named them all, Deborah?
Those hives, I don't name the bees. But that would be quite the
Take it away, Deborah.
Okay, so this time of year across most of America, we're in what is called swarm season, and I would be remiss to not mention that. If anybody, could we put up the first slide, please? I can't see if the slide is up.
It's going to come in what, then there it is. Be a friendly consumer. Up, swarm of bees.
So if anyone sees anything at all close to resembling these pictures, please, please, please do not pick up a can of bug spray. Do not call pest control. Call a beekeeper. And if you're on Long Island, you can check out the Long Island Beekeepers Club website. Anywhere in New York, you can contact the Dice Honeybee Laboratory. And all across America, if you're zooming in from anywhere, call a local beekeeping club or your local Cornell or local environmental group. Even call the police. I mean, I'm sure they get the calls, or the fire department. So the honeybees are at their most vulnerable state of life when they're in this swarm situation. They have nothing to protect. They have very little defenses, and all they're doing is looking for a home. And I think one of our speakers is going to talk about when honeybees do find a home, but maybe not where people want them to be. So under no circumstance really should a swarm of honeybees be killed, they can be easily and safely removed and rehomed to live and pollinate our food and our beautiful plants, our trees. They give us oxygen, they give the food and the shelter to wildlife. So next slide, please. The status of the honeybees across the world is actually not doing too bad. If you look at this graph, you'll see that the honeybee population is increasing globally. The problem, we have a slight problem in Europe, but we have a bigger problem here in America. So the largest global health threat to honeybees today, and also other pollinators like bumblebees, is the varroa mite. The varroa mite would be like a tick the size of a dinner plate sitting on your body, sucking. What the mites do on the bees is they suck something called the fat body. So it's like your liver, and they give diseases, pests and diseases. So yes, we do have a global honeybee problem, but we have to think about that. If the mite is across the entire globe, why are American honeybees in such decline? Next slide, please. So you can see that the bees have been in decline, not a recent colony collapse disorder, which is really a new name for an old situation that bees have experienced for a very, very long time. But if you look at the graph, you could see around the 1940s, we had close to 6 million colonies. Today, we have under 3 million. The new results just came out yesterday from the Bee Informed Partnership. Last summer, America experienced the largest summer die-off of honeybees ever recorded. The prior winter, we experienced the largest honeybee die-off ever recorded here in America. We have an America problem compared to the global bee problem, and it's something that we need to address. Next slide, please. So obviously, pesticides are a huge issue. Pesticides include herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and they cause a lot of problems for a lot of people. There's also, next slide, please. If you look at the world use of pesticides, it's about 6 billion tons. 6 billion tons of pesticides pumped into the planet. Look at America, that last small gray bar, that's about 1 billion tons of pesticides. We use 1/6 of the world's pesticides here in America. So yes, the varroa mite is a problem, but we are working on it. What we're not working on is our pesticide use. Next slide, please. And you could see our biggest problem in America is the herbicides. The herbicides are applied mostly by agriculture. And the big problem with the herbicides and the bees and all the pollinators is that it takes away their food. So we're killing all of the pollinators' food by applying all of these herbicides. Homeowners are also quite responsible for what they apply to their home, and we're killing our local honeybees. We don't have a lot of ag here on Long Island, but we do have a lot of problems with pesticides. So that's something I really want people to think about. Next slide, please. This sign is really telling. If you see a little smiley face on the side, on the right side there, it says last weekly spray. This is a prophylactic spraying. We don't have a problem. We have a problem with bugs. We have an insect apocalypse right now where we're losing much of our bugs and our insects, including honeybees. But we have a prophylactic spray. Let's only spray if we actually have a problem, and maybe just spray yourself. This is a little tick spray. Just spray yourself. You don't have to spray the entire yard. Next slide, please. So when we're, next slide. One of the problems, as I mentioned, with the herbicides is taking away the bees' forage. I did some research a few years back, and I had to find out what honeybees were foraging on in our community. And what I found in this study was that they really enjoy privet. So the takeaway message that I think everyone can do to help bees, if you have privet, do not shear the privet until the flowers are done blooming. You will have not only honeybees, but butterflies and bumblebees and all kinds of insect pollinators on that privet. These were the top 6 food sources that I identified in this study. So all of these different plants, the bees really, really like. And these are the clover. Do not do the herbicides all over your lawn. Let the bees have a little bit of clover. They really, really love it. And you can see from this data that I collected what they really prefer. And they actually, I found 69 different species in the honey. I had tested the pollen in the honey to see what the bees were foraging on. Next slide, please. And this is an easy way. Both of these sources are very easy ways for you to find different plants that will be suitable to your home. The town of East Hampton puts out a really great brochure that tells you not only what's good for Long Island, but if you have a salt marsh habitat in your yard, or a woodland habitat, or a dune habitat, they actually go into specifics onto what plants do best in those particular habitats. So the pollinator.org is great for anywhere in the country. You enter your zip code, it tells you what's good to plant. Town of East Hampton, you can use that information anywhere, even if you're in Florida, depending on your specific microenvironment. Next slide, please. Another thing that the homeowner can do, or anyone can do, to help the honeybees and other pollinators is to provide them water. They can go through about a gallon of water a day in the summertime, each colony. So putting out water in these shallow dishes with rocks or shells or corks or anything like that, you can help the honeybees, and you'll see a lot of other pollinators, really good photo opportunities. You'll see some really interesting insects gathering water for their needs. Next slide, please. A lot of different ways, I tried to think a little outside the box, besides planting flowers and giving them water, not spraying pesticides. There's different ways that you can use your dollars in order to help protect pollinators. And one of them would be research, research into pesticides, but also you see those yellow signs on a business that you normally frequent. Either don't frequent the business or start the conversation and let them know how important it is to you to frequent businesses that don't poison the whole planet and kill all the honeybees. The other thing that we do really need to think about is, our farming practices. We are pumping so much poison into our food systems, and we're consuming that food. So it just isn't good for anybody. And the last thing that I don't think too much research is being done is the synergistic effects of different fungicides interacting with pesticides makes a fungicide that normally wouldn't be detrimental to certain species, makes it like 1,000 times more toxic to those species. So there's a lot of things that need to be researched, but in lieu of research, we can just reduce our use and go to kinder farming practices and kinder practices on our own in our own backyards, really, to help not only the honeybees, the other pollinators. If we can help all pollinators, we'll be helping the honeybees as well. And I think that's about all I've got.
Okay, thank you so much, Deborah. We're going to just hold questions to the end. Okay, our next speaker is Dan from Cornell Cooperative Extension. Dan, you're on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Adrienne. And I guess you can put up the slides here and start with that first one. So great to join you, everybody. Thanks for being here. As Adrian noted, I'm the entomologist. I work a lot with our landscape and horticulture industries, our agriculture, and also homeowners and master gardeners to try to find ways of dealing with insects in a more compatible manner. And we've heard all about the issues with pesticides, and we do have some issues with it in groundwater on Long Island, and it's always good to find alternatives to the things that are causing environmental harm and damage. So I thought I'd talk about some of the alternatives that you could use. But first, next slide, please. This is just a kind of a reiteration of some of what Deborah was talking about. This is some of the problems that honeybees in particular are experiencing. This is from EPA's website, and all of these are things that honeybees are dealing with, and particularly she noted varroa mite and honeybee diseases are pretty serious right now, but there's other factors, and these can conspire and interact to create even more problems. Next slide, please. We have over 400 kinds of bees in New York, 21 of which at least are non-native, including, of course, honeybees that are non-native here. And in this study, they found in apple orchards upstate New York, 110 species of wild bees were in apples, and the diversity abundance of them were associated with higher fruit set. And they found that some of these bees are much better pollinators and more efficient pollinators than honeybees. It doesn't mean the honeybees are not good. They're very valuable and very useful and very necessary, particularly when you have a huge job, as this orchard can give you a sense of when there's so many flowers. But the native bees, I think, are underappreciated and ununderstood, and the study helped bring some of that out. Next slide. Closer to home, this was a really interesting study that talked about the pollinator assemblages, the pollinators on our own home lawns. So on lawns where we allow dandelions and white clover to grow, they found, next slide please, that there were over 50 different kinds of pollinator species present in this environment. And that's, of course, only when you let these flowering kinds of plants grow in the lawns. And a lot of people don't do that on Long Island. Their idea of a perfect lawn is one without any of these things. But clover can actually make a nice addition into the lawn and provide good forage and food sources for these pollinators. Next slide, please. And that, of course, implies that if you're going to allow that, you should be careful about how you're managing lawns with consideration to the animals that are feeding on using them for their food sources. Another one you can encounter in your home landscape is this one. These are plaster or cellophane bees. Every spring we get calls about this, some of them complaining about these bees that are in parts of their lawn. They're often found in areas that are drier where the grass is thinner and soil is a little sandier, in sunny sites. And these are solitary bees, but they often nest in colonies, and you'll see them. And they're very gentle bees. They are non-aggressive. They really don't want to sting you at all. You have to work very hard to make them do that. But they'll be active, and they're ones you can enjoy and appreciate, at least for the short time that they're present during spring and up to the maybe early summer. And one thing that encourages them is having food sources, like everything else you've provided at home. And so providing the food sources for early blooming plants like those listed will be helpful to them. Next slide. Another one you can encounter is this very cute little bee. This is called a squash bee, and this has been really important in pollinating cucurbits, things like pumpkins, summer squash, melons, and you'll see these in almost every home garden and every commercial planting. They nest in the ground, and they act a little drunk when they get into these flowers because they'll be full of nectar and they're kind of fun to watch, but they're very, very, very excellent pollinators, very efficient, and they're just interested in, well, primarily interested in these kinds of plants. Next slide, please. But don't forget that bees are not the only pollinators. There's other ones too. Flies are next, and if you appreciate chocolate, you can thank a fly. If you like pawpaws, you can thank a fly. The flower is on the upper left, and this gives off an odor like carrion, which you can't really smell too much, but the flies can detect it, and attracts flies that are attracted to carrion who are fooled by it, and the flies are actually doing the pollinating job. And there's some other ones there. Even mosquitoes are pollinators. There's a habanera orchid that's pollinated by a mosquito, and there's a bee fly on the lower right, and then some other plants, jack in the pulpit, skunk cabbage, wild ginger in the center there, and trillium are all fly pollinated plants. And there's a little fly in the lower left that's a syrphid or flower fly. The immature stages of that are beneficial predators of aphids and some other insects, so they're nice to have around. Next slide, please. Beetles are pollinators too, to some extent. Some of them are, and this is a beautiful locust borer. And if you are lucky to have some black locust trees, which are great for honeybees and other bees, being great nectar sources in the spring, you'll probably also see this insect, a beautiful beetle, on the goldenrod nearby, because they love to forage for the pollen on the flowers. And in the course of doing so, they'll be pollinating the plants too. Next slide. Of course, a good reason to get out there is to enjoy and appreciate and learn about the pollinators, but you'll also encounter other insects, and part of my job is to help people understand and appreciate and recognize, so they don't think that everything is an insect that has to be destroyed, that there's a lot of things that are wonderful, and even pests in low levels are very much tolerated and in many cases very much needed. On the upper right is not a bumblebee, it is a robber fly, and that's a predator of other insects. Of course, the lower right is a luna moth. On the left side, you'll see a purplish brown looper, and there's the caterpillar stage trying very hard to look like a twig, and on the upper left is a dogbane leaf beetle, and even though dogbane is considered a weed, this is one great reason to go looking around a dogbane so you can see this wonderful beetle that's out there. So when you get out and start looking for these pollinators and begin to appreciate it, you'll see all these amazing, wonderful things in our environment that are there just for the viewing. Next slide. This is an interesting statement by Doug Tallamy, and I think it really turns on its head the way we look at our landscapes. I think we need to look at our home landscapes and environment in a much more ecological and environmental way. We haven't really done that. We design them to appeal to us, maybe for low maintenance or other reasons, or just for looks, for everybody else to see. But think of them as bird feeders. If you really appreciate songbirds, you'd like to have them around, as well as pollinators, you can design your landscape about that. Chickadees will eat about 400 caterpillars a day, but they'll only do that if they have a source of them. Oak trees are one great source of them, and if you have oak trees in your property, you're probably feeding a lot of birds without knowing it. And birds don't feed their babies bird seed, they feed them insects. So what you can do in your home landscape environment to conserve insects and keep them around will also attract the birds to that extent. And of course, things like lady beetles, if you want to have them around, you have to have something to feed them. They don't just come and stay because we like to have them there. Next slide, please. This is kind of a typical day in the diagnostic lab, the kind of things, and I wanted to talk about some things that you can do in your own landscape. And so these are the kinds of questions I get and how I would answer them. So in the upper center is a shot hole disease. It was brought in as an insect question. They thought something was chewing the leaves. It's actually more like a disease problem, and it's a cherry laurel. And it's one reason why we don't recommend planting that plant in most cases, because it's often prone to that, especially in areas where it's going to stay wet or humid. On the upper right is not a murder hornet, as you've been hearing in the news. This is a European hornet, and it's now well established on the East Coast. It's all around, but when the queens are coming out in the spring, we got lots of complaints about the murder hornets, which it's not. We don't have murder hornets on Long Island. Lower right, we're getting a lot of questions these days about this one. It's an eyed click beetle, and they're a harmless insect, except if you're a longhorn beetle larva in wood, and the larvae are voracious predators of those, so that's a good thing. And the center is an arborvitae that's experiencing problems of stress, probably due to lack of water or regular watering. It could also be overwatering, and that's a real common problem in landscapes. It's not arborvitae leaf miner, which is what was suspecting. On the lower left is a witch hazel with an interesting caterpillar that we don't get to see very often, but it's rather beautiful. And even though it's causing some damage and making holes in leaves, it's really nice to see, and it's beautiful and so uncommon. It's just a treat when we get to see them. And of course, some birds will eat them at some point too. Upper right is a Mediterranean cockroach. These don't like to really come into homes, but it's a new invasive in our area, and we're getting more reports of those. So just to reassure people that this is not likely to establish in your house. You're more likely to see it outside. Next slide, please. This is one question we got also. These were eating their Euonymus, and that's a twice-stabbed lady beetle, and its larval stage, and they weren't eating the Euonymus, they were eating the Euonymus scales, which are notorious for killing Euonymus. This was introduced to this country deliberately for combating this non-native pest, and it has been quite successful, but I've had to calm people down who are ready to get out and spray to control something like this because they didn't recognize it as a beneficial insect. Next slide, please. And once you get out, you start looking and recognizing all these other biological controls. There's many ones here. Some are familiar, obviously lady beetles, and other ones that are not. But you'll begin to understand and appreciate a little more of the cycle of things, and that these are not things to be sprayed, that they're to be appreciated and cultivated. Next slide, please. I think one of the biggest issues that we get to deal with is cultural management issues, environmental care of landscape plants. And this is a landscape that was getting way too much water. There was a lot of problems with compaction. So the grass could survive in a sort of a hydroponic environment, but the trees were suffering, as you could see. And a lot of people are not very careful about the amount of water they put out, how often, when, where, and what's it aiming at. They think about the lawns, they don't think about the trees and shrubs. And that extends even to fertilizer. Fertilizer can be a big problem, encouraging growth of aphids and adelgids, making those problems worse and requiring then people to treat, to knock those down or deal with them in other ways. So taking more care about our cultural management, getting a soil test are really important things that we can do to improve plant health and also reduce, in many cases, the pest problems that these plants are having, and therefore the treatments that are required to maintain them. Next slide. I think a bigger revolution can be made in how we look at things too. This is a Japanese maple, and it has some damage on the leaves. People object to this. That's not beautiful. They think it's a problem. Well, it's actually not hurting the plant very much. It's caused by this little jumping bush cricket, which is becoming more common in our area, and they graze on these leaves late in the summer. But they're not really hurting the plant. Most of the work of the leaves is done for the season, so you don't really need to spray to prevent it and or to control it. But I think if we can tolerate these kinds of things, a little cosmetic injury more, we won't feel the need for use of controls, organic or otherwise. All these things can impact the bees in some ways. Go next slide, please. This is a problem we've seen a lot, especially last year, the shot hole miner. People were ready to get out and spray for this, but by the time you see it, it's all over with. You wouldn't really control it anyway, and there's no real controls label for it. This is a fly. It's out early in the year, and it feeds on the sap in the leaves, and in doing so, creates these little injured areas that open up as the leaves expand. So the leaves can look sometimes kind of tattered, but the plants usually have no problem and survive. It's just a cosmetic thing. So this is another case of where we can tolerate it, I think, without needing to resort to an insecticide for managing it. Next slide. This is a small carpenter bee, and we've heard about carpenter bees causing structural damage. This one is feeding in little stems. They're not feeding, but they're using little pithy stems as their homes. And that is fine as long as it's like a dead hydrangea stem, which I leave specifically for them to use, and other stems. But if they're going after a rose, next slide, you can see there's a pithy stem there. If you're pruning your roses, they'll go into there and you can get some dieback as a consequence of their nesting activity. And so a simple solution is to put a tack on the end of the stem as you prune, or you can drop a little bit of wax. So this is a solution to that problem. We had another case of these larger carpenter bees that were burrowing into a deck, and I suggested the person just put some screening in front of it, and that kept the bees away and no more damage. Next slide. These are problems if you're trying to grow brassicas of any kind, broccoli, cabbage, any of those wonderful things that we all enjoy, flea beetles, cabbage maggot, and imported cabbage worm, one of the few butterflies that's actually a pest. Next slide. And this is what we're been working on. This is just a photo of one of our trials, but we've been promoting this quite a bit and working on the mechanics of it to help growers, but also home gardeners can take advantage of this immediately. This is using exclusion netting to keep these pests out. And there's a frustrated little flea beetle on the left there that really can't figure out how to quite get through that netting. So this is something you can do. And when we find when you use this on like a cabbage crop like here, we will not need to treat it with any insecticides. And that can be the same for other kinds of plants or home gardens. Next slide. Straw mulch is one way to deter potato beetles. It doesn't provide 100%, but it's pretty good, and you can get a much reduced population with that. And notice the deer fencing in the background. Deer can be a problem too, and by putting up fencing, you can also help reduce the tick infestations. Deer are the major reason we have tick populations around Long Island. They're part of the issue. Next slide, please. Just simply removing things by hand. If you're not feeling intrepid, you could get somebody else who is to do it for you. But we have hornworms, we have tent caterpillars, we had a lot of fall webworms last year, and on the upper right are some dogwood sawflies. So when you see them, just take them off, by hand. Take them off by hand, feed them to your chickens, and that will do good on both ends of the spectrum. Next slide. Common bagworm has gotten a lift up because of the mild winter, increased survival, and this is the kind of thing you can end up with if you don't pay attention to it. The eggs have already hatched by now, but if you remove these bags by mid-June or before, this is where the eggs are, and you can prevent this kind of defoliation from happening. If you don't get to that point, look for them now. They're very small, and you can use a BT or just remove the little tiny bags by hand if you've got a lot of time and just a few of them around. So that's one way to deal with that. Next slide. We've been getting a lot of more complaints about this. These are leaf miners that go after Swiss chard and beets and spinach. And if you see these early on, just pick these leaves off and discard them or bury them, and that'll take care of this problem. And just keep doing it as you see some, and that should suppress the population pretty well. Next slide. If you put up 3 of these sticky red spheres, you'll fool the apple maggots into thinking that there's red apples around way before they normally are, and they come attracted to them and get trapped on them, and 3 of these traps per tree is enough to control this problem. Next slide. One way to deal with aphids is just get out the garden hose and wash them off. Use a little bit of a power wash to get them off the stems, and that's usually enough. You'll notice some on the right that there's some ants there. and the ants are using the aphids like little cows. They're sort of milking them for the honeydew that they produce, and also in the course of doing that, protect them. So they're helping to keep the aphid populations high, keep the predators away. Next slide. So what we found, what this particular paper found, was that by keeping the ants away from the insects, you could allow access to the biological controls that normally would be there but are otherwise deterred. And on the magnolia on the right, one way they did this is through a sticky band around the base of the tree, and that's not applied directly to the bark, but there's a band that sticky material is on it, and that keeps the ants from crawling up and getting to the scales to feed on the honeydew and protecting them, so the natural enemies can then get to them. Next slide. And I think the last thought I want to leave you with, if we like the pollinators and butterflies in particular, you want to plant gardens for them. And so the next slide, think about planting a caterpillar garden, or think about planting a pollinator garden, things that will provide for them and for the whole season, particularly late in the season when the forage is particularly limited. Next slide. And I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dan. Last but absolutely not least, we have Dan, the staff attorney from NRDC, is going to talk about what can we do about saving the bees from a political perspective. But Dan, you're on.
Great. So let me just get to the first slide here and start the slideshow. Okay. So my name is Dan Rochelle. I'm a staff attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I work on our pollinator team. And I want to talk a little bit today about neonicotinoid pesticides, or neonics for short. The first question is, what are neonics? Well, neonics are neurotoxic insecticides, which means they are pesticides designed to kill bugs, like all the ones you just saw, by attacking their nerves. And we have three main concerns with neonics. The first is that they are super duper toxic to insects. So to give you a sense of scale, just one neonic treated corn seed can have enough active ingredient to kill about 250,000 bees or more. And really it was bees that first got us interested or concerned with neonics. In the mid-2000s, beekeepers saw their colony losses jump from about 10–15% a year to 30, 40, 50% a year. And as Deborah mentioned, last summer was the worst summer on record. And while there are a lot of issues that affect bees, there's varroa mite, as Deborah mentioned, there's climate change, there is habitat loss, there are pathogens. There was only one factor that mapped really well with that huge sudden spike in losses that we saw in the mid-2000s, and that is the sudden spike in use of neonic pesticides. So this chart is from a study that came out last year showing that neonics have made US agriculture about 48 times more harmful to insect life than before they were introduced. So second problem with neonics is that they really easily contaminate the whole environment. So they're systemic insecticides, which means unlike a older conventional pesticide that you spray on the plant, it kills the bug and then it dissipates. Neonics are designed to permeate the plant, to get into the leaves, the roots, the fruit, the pollen, to make the plant itself poisonous to insects, to make the plant itself the pesticide. This means neonics can be applied in all sorts of interesting new ways. They can, of course, be sprayed on the plant, but they can also be painted on the outside of a crop seed. And that's what these are. They look kind of like Skittles with all the pesticides painted on them. Here's a close-up of some corn seed with some pesticides painted on it. And the way that neonics are designed to work is as that corn plant grows, it literally soaks up the active ingredient, the poison, through its root system, making the plant poisonous. It's not a terribly efficient way of administering the neonics or the pesticides. Only about 2 to 5% get into the target crop plant. The other 94+% stays in the soil where it can persist for years. And that same property that lets them get into the plant, their water solubility, makes them really easily dissolvable in rain or irrigation water. So anytime there is a rain event, anytime there is irrigation, those neonics that are stuck in the soil, they're moving through soil, they're contaminating new soil. If there are wildflowers in that adjacent soil, those wildflowers are soaking up the pesticides, they're becoming toxic, their pollen, their nectar. If there's a water source nearby, that water source is becoming contaminated with neonics. Third problem with neonics is that they're just all over the place. They're the most popular insecticides in the US. A lot of people think about neonic use on farms, which they're used extensively, but they're also in lawns, home gardens, commercial landscapes. Here's some home products that have neonics in them. They're in dog collars. Just about anywhere where you would want to kill a bug, there is a neonic product for that use. And to give you a sense of what this looks like on the whole, neonics are just extensively used across the United States. That bottom right picture is just a map of neonic use of just one of the chemicals, and there are 5 approved. Just one of the chemicals, and just in agriculture. So that's not even in a complete map. And I know 2009 is not terribly recent, but that map today would look at least as filled in, if not more. So what you have in some is, you know, soil and water contamination across the country on an almost unprecedented scale. And in areas where neonics are being used year after year after year, because they last in the soil for more than a year, you have a battery of sort of toxicity building up over the course of years and then spreading out every time it rains. So what's the effect of all of this? The first is that neonics are definitely killing bees. There was some debate 15 years ago, but it's confirmed in the scientific literature now. Neonic use is a lead driver of these sort of recent massive bee losses that we found. And as you know, Deborah sort of hinted at in her presentation, beekeepers are replenishing these bee colonies, right? There's a whole industry for honeybees that is replenishing these bees year after year after year. So even though we're seeing these crazy losses, honeybee numbers on the whole are doing okay, even if beekeepers are, you know, wasting lots of money or spending lots of money breeding these colonies. The problem is, you know, New York has a number of wild bee species, and those wild bee species are not, and I think my number is maybe a little bit off, I think it's 400 plus, but those wild bee species don't have the same benefit. And those include bees that look different than your normal bee, and I think Dan showed some of them, green and orange and blue. I'm not sure if all of these are native to New York. And these wild bees are important not just for agriculture, which they are, but they're also important for ecosystems. Just about 90% of the world's flowering plants require some sort of pollinator to propagate. So if you have further losses of pollinators, you start to see not only food security issues, but the collapse of ecosystems. In case it wasn't bad enough, we're also learning that neonics do all sorts of other bad things too. So we know that neonics are toxic to birds, and in fact, one neonic treated corn seed can have enough active ingredient to kill a small songbird if it eats that seed, which birds often do. And sort of beyond that, and Dan mentioned this a little bit, birds like to eat bugs. So when you have a pesticide that is contaminating the landscape and killing not just bees, but all sorts of insect life, that's bad for birds too. And we have some studies in Europe showing that, you know, where neonic use is associated with losses of insect-eating birds, somewhat unsurprisingly. As it turns out, fish also like to eat bugs. A good study out of Japan showing that introduction of neonics in nearby agriculture to a sustainable fishery effectively wiped out that fishery in the course of a year. You know, what the scientists posited is it effectively destroyed communities of these water bugs, water insects that the fish depended on for food. And when the bugs disappeared, the fish starved. Last but certainly not least, neonics are part of our daily life too. So the CDC finds that about half the US population is regularly exposed to neonics. And that's shown by the neonics appearing in people's urine or a byproduct appearing. And that's an alarming number because studies suggest that neonics may increase the risk of developmental or neurological damage. And, you know, again, the problem with neonics is if you have an apple that's treated with neonics, You can't wash them off. They're literally inside the apple. They get into everything. So they're very difficult to avoid. It's a big problem in New York. We see neonics all over New York water. State and federal water testing show that they're frequently in surface waters and almost a third of Long Island groundwater. The levels detected would be those where you'd expect ecosystem-wide damage, again, sort of killing the bugs that all of the other animals eat and having those effects ripple up through the ecosystem. You know, the testing that we have is probably an underestimate. Most of the water testing in New York only looks, again, for 1 of 5 neonics. So probably the results are worse than we know, or the reality is worse than the results. And, you know, this is a concern in New York because about 3/4 of New York population gets their drinking water from surface water. New York City famously has unfiltered surface water, drinking water, so that's a concern there. And of course, it's a concern on Long Island where you see groundwater contamination. Real quick, what has the rest of the world done? Well, Europe has moved to ban outdoor uses of the 3 most popular and toxic neonics. Canada's moving to do the same. France has banned all 5 neonics. EPA, I won't get into it. They just released some decisions, but suffice to say that the Trump administration, EPA is doing next to nothing, although it is doing a very little bit. And other states have passed laws that, you know, have taken some small steps, but really not the sort of action that we've needed. Fortunately, in New York, we have the Birds and Bees Protection Act. New York is poised to be a leader on this issue. The Birds and Bees Protection Act, which is in the legislature now in both houses, would place a 5-year moratorium on outdoor neonic use with some exceptions, and would require a New York Department of Environmental Conservation and Agriculture and Markets to study the costs and benefits of reintroducing neonic use after 5 years. You know, as luck would have it, Cornell University just released a report on exactly this question 2 days ago, or a day and a half ago. And that report is interesting because it provides a roadmap for potentially some permanent protections, not just a temporary moratorium. So one of the things that the report found was that neonic treated corn and soybean seed, which represent about 73% of all the neonics used in New York agriculture, present huge risks to bees and other pollinators, but don't provide consistent benefits to farmers. So that might be a pretty sort of low-hanging, easy target to get those uses out of New York State to permanently prohibit them. And something else, and Dan was talking a lot about alternatives, but ornamentals, landscape uses of pesticides are really high risk to bees and other pollinators. And in most cases, they're replaceable with safer alternatives. A lot of times, you know, not using chemicals at all, but also some chemicals that are safer alternatives. So that's another sort of low-hanging fruit that might merit some permanent protections. But for the meantime, we do have the Birds and Bees Protection Act. It's a great piece of legislation. We're going to hopefully be pushing it in what we hope to be a special session in the fall. You know, adding on to what folks can do to help protect pollinators, let your legislators know that you support the Birds and Bees Protection Act and other legislation to protect pollinators. So I think it's questions, right?
Yes, thank you. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. You guys were absolutely wonderful. We appreciate it. I just want to let folks know a couple of things. One is that CCE, our Citizens Campaign for the Environment, in partnership with NRDC and other organizations, are actively working collaboratively to pass the Birds and Bees Protection Act, which, as Dan said, would put a 5-year moratorium on the use of neonicotinoids. And, you know, the legislature, as you all know, shut down abruptly, you know, in March. And they may have a special session in September, but if we have to continue our work in January, we will do that. So we're very committed to protecting pollinators, particularly bees, and it's not going away. And the use, unfortunately, of this pesticide doesn't seem to be going away also. I just wanted, because I see a lot of folks are here who are on Long Island, a couple on Fire Island. One of the big issues with neonicotinoids, particularly the specific chemical imidacloprid, is that it does contaminate groundwater, which is our drinking water supplies. And in fact, a little known fact that's not good news is that imidacloprid is the most common pesticide found in Long Island drinking water. So out of the 3 most common pesticides, imidacloprid is up here, and then you have metaaxyl, and then you have atrazine, which has already been banned. So we are very sensitive, we meaning an aquifer, to imidacloprid because it moves very rapidly through drinking water and through an aquifer system. And that's one of the other reasons, in addition to pollinators, why it needs to be banned, because we don't want to drink our pesticides at all. So let me just go to the chat area here. We have a number of questions building up. Let's take, in no particular order. Lisa has asked, what is the best resource? Maybe this is for you, Deborah. What is the best resource to start beekeeping? Is there a particular resource if she wants to become a beekeeper that she can turn to?
I think the best thing to do is to pick up a couple of books, start reading, attend some beekeeping classes, join a local beekeeping club, but definitely do not dive into it without a good base of knowledge. Beekeeping is difficult. You need to know about the pests and diseases. You need to know how to attack those enemies of the bees, and in order to know how to keep the bees. So definitely start reading, join a bee club. Adrian, I also just wanted to piggyback on that legislation. We also have legislation pending in New York State right now in the Senate and the Assembly, which mimics New Jersey legislation, which will prevent the extermination of honeybee swarms or colonies that end up in structures where they're unwanted. So what the folks listening can do is to write letters to your local legislators saying that you support this bill. It was introduced by Senator Biaggi over in the Bronx, and it started moving through the houses, but because of the pandemic, I think it stopped. But it basically states that 3 beekeepers need to come and assess the situation before pest control is called and these bees are exterminated. So there's other pending legislation that can help the honeybees. I just want to.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that, Deborah. I appreciate that. And for those on with CC Citizens Campaign for the Environment, it's going to have a whole section on the website on bees, and both of these bills will be listed. Okay, Brian? Okay. Just a quick plug, Deborah, while you're there. Maureen is asking, where can she buy your honey?
We sell out every year. Most beekeepers do. And right now the bees are busy gathering nectar and then they turn it into honey. So it's going to take, a couple of weeks to a month or two before our local honey is ready here in the Eastern Long Island. But I usually sell it, at local One Stop and Breadzilla. But people can always contact me, through Instagram, Facebook, or my website. And, it's in a lot of places, but right now we're sold out.
Okay. And it's Bonac Bees, so everyone knows. Okay. Kathleen is asking, are coastal wetlands a good environment for bees? Which and any particular water-loving plants would attract bees?
Well, here's the thing. It takes about 1 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey. And each honeybee only makes 1/12 of a teaspoon in their entire lifetime. So you would have to plant a tremendous amount of flowering plants on your property. The biggest thing that people can do to help the honeybees to give them food is to plant a tree or some bushes. There's a lot of studies out that show that trees and bushes, and the study that I did here on Long Island showed me the same thing, that bees prefer trees and bushes because there's more bang for their buck. You'd have to plant an entire acre of wildflowers to get the same amount of food that 1 tree can provide. So plant a tree, some privet. They love privet and they love sumac. Inexpensive, easy to grow, doesn't require pesticides or lots of water. So easy to grow and, without a lot of input, definitely help the bees.
Okay, but I want to ask one of the Dans, are coastal wetlands a good environment for bees?
I'm going to defer to the other. Because I am not an entomologist. Yeah.
Well, I think it depends on what wetland and what area we're talking about. It depends on the if it's a freshwater or the saltwater, and you can see some flowering trees next to some of these wetlands, and those would could certainly be good pollinator resources. Pickerel weed is used by bees. It's in the freshwater areas. It's not a saltwater species. I don't tend to see a lot of blooming plants in saltwater wetlands and saltwater areas directly, but in perimeter areas that might provide more forage and resources. I don't know if Deborah wants to weigh in on that too, but that's my
Yeah, I would
observation.
say keep in mind that honeybees travel up to 3 miles.
Right,
So
that's
whatever
right.
you do on this property, they're going to go find the sweetest, you know, they're animals and they want to exert the least amount of energy in order to, you know, gather what they need. So they're going to go to that tree down the road. You know, so bees can do well on any property. They just don't want a very wet area for their home to be in. You know, just something high and dry on a basically they are
That's all we
everywhere.
all want.
Excuse me?
I said, that's all we all want, something high and dry.
Exactly. And, you know, bees have been brought by people all across the entire world. They are not native to North America. We brought them here in 1622. And by 1850, they were all the way to California. We brought them to Virginia. So, I mean, everywhere man has been, bees are. So they do well just about anywhere.
Okay, great. We're getting a couple of questions about imidacloprid and neonicotinoids. Are there substitutes or replacements on the market right now that are less toxic or non-toxic? I'll leave that for Dan and Dan.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Dan actually highlighted really well that a lot of times the best substitute for using a pesticide like a neonic is nothing, or some sort of mechanical control or cultural control. So that's usually your best option. And you also have situations where people are using an insecticide to treat for a disease, right? Where there's no actual insect problem, where you're trying to fight something that doesn't exist. And to a large degree, that happens on farms too, right? We have neonics on corn and soybean seeds for problems that are not going to materialize, right? They're not really providing any real benefits for farmers, but they're being used everywhere. So aside from nothing, you know, there are safer products, there are organic products. So, you know, we have to remember that organic agriculture, you can't use neonics in organic agriculture or any sort of a synthetic insecticide. So there are alternatives. Not that all organic insecticides are great, but there are other ways to, you know, there are better, safer options, including even some synthetics, but really you want to just try to avoid pesticides where you can. And if you really, really, really need to use one, opt for something, you know, in the organic or minimum risk category. In fact, EPA has a whole sort of minimum risk list of pesticides, you know, that include a lot of natural ingredients.
Alternatives. So I think this question is right along with that. So is there a list of products that do contain imidacloprid or neonicotinoids that people can say to themselves, okay, here's a list of products that contain it, so they don't want to buy that?
That's a really good question. I don't know if
that list. It's a good question.
I don't know if there's any comprehensive list that lists all of the brand names. And what's really tricky is that sometimes you can have a brand name and it has, you know, like a 20 or 30 different products, and some of them will have neonics, some of them won't, some of them will have other synthetic insecticides, which are also bad. So I think, you know, what you really need to do is, again, try and not use pesticides, or try and use organic or minimum risk pesticides where you can, and read the label. So, you know, every pesticide that has a neonic by law has to have a label telling you what's in it, what the active ingredient is. And you can look for the 5 neonic active ingredients, Google it, but it's acetamiprid, clothianidin, imidacloprid, dinotefuran, and thiamethoxam. And if you see that on the label,
I was going to say that too.
Yeah, yeah.
Wait, okay, let's get one last question in because I want to be conscious of the time. Alex's question, is Miracle Grow okay? That's for all 3 of you.
Again, I don't know. I mean, I think there are a lot of different Miracle Grow products. You gotta worry about these all-in-one products that say they're going to fertilize and you know, kill bugs at the same time. Anything that offers or advertises any sort of insecticidal properties that it's going to kill bugs, very well might have a neonic in it. So watch out for that.
I should just mention that none of the home garden neonic products, with the exception of maybe acetamiprid, are allowed for use on Long Island. So you can't go to the garden centers, you can't go to Home Depot and buy any of those products containing imidacloprid or thiamethoxam or dinotefuran. Those are not sold to home gardeners at these outlets, and they're illegal for sale here.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And the fact that you're still seeing imidacloprid as as the most common pesticide in the aquifer, I mean, it shows maybe a few folks are breaking the rules, but also just how good these pesticides are at moving through the environment and getting.
Well, Dan, but what it also shows is that it might be banned from homeowner use, but it's not banned from landscape use. So on Long Island, one of the things we can do too is the landscapers who are coming and spraying all over our lawns and spraying because we can't have clover. That is one we believe a significant way that the imidacloprid is still entering into groundwater supplies and killing bees.
Yeah, totally.
All right, last one I got to get in is extract of neem oil safe. Dan Gilrein?
It depends on how it's used and for what and with timing and all that. We've done a fair bit of work with neem oil products. These are Triactin Trilogy. Those are the main commercial ones sold. They're not sold as just straight neem oil. Neem oil is used alone, is not legal for use as a pesticide, but these are the formulated products. They are organically compatible. You can use them like a regular horticultural oil. But we have seen some, just like you would with any other paraffinic, petroleum-derived horticultural, we've seen some leaf spotting, burn, that kind of thing. Oils are not particularly good during the heat of summer or on plants that are drought stressed. So there's some qualifications you have to attach with some of these things, just because of that. But we've had very good results against things like spider mites. They should work pretty well on aphids, and they're used for powdery mildew and for other things, and they can be just fine for those things. Yeah.
Okay, so let me see again. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. There were over 50 people on this Zoom presentation, which I think is great. Great questions. Thank you so much, very, very much to our presenters, Deborah, Dan, and Dan. We appreciate your expertise, your talent, your time. It really is very valuable to us. Also, please sign up for CCE's email alert so you can stay in touch with these issues and all the work that we're going to be doing to save the bees. And we're going to create a buzz, I promise. So thank you again, everybody. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.